The delayed flight. The morning began as usual for Celia Hartman, a woman of precision and routine. At 38, she had built a reputation as an unstoppable force in the world of corporate mergers. Everything in her life was methodical, from the time she woke up at exactly 5:15 a.m. to her meticulously curated wardrobe that screamed both authority and elegance. Celia's world thrived on control, leaving no room for inefficiency or unexpected disruptions. By 6:45 a.m., she was already at the airport, her carry-on bag perfectly packed with essentials, her laptop, neatly organized files, a tailored black suit, and a pair of polished heels. She breezed through security, her movements fluid and practiced. The chaos of the airport, a flurry of hurried passengers, crying children, and endless announcements, was nothing but background noise to her. Her mind was already preoccupied with the presentation she had to give later that afternoon in New York. Another multimillion-dollar deal rested on her ability to deliver it flawlessly. Celia was among the first to board, her status as a frequent flyer granting her access to the coveted front rows. She settled into her aisle seat, pulling out her laptop before most passengers even made it past the jet bridge. As the plane filled, she barely looked up from her screen, her focus unshakable. But a commotion broke her concentration. A man in uniform struggled to lift a heavy duffel bag into the overhead compartment just a few rows ahead. His crisp navy attire marked him as a serviceman, but the creases in his jacket and the bags under his eyes spoke of long days and restless nights. Celia glanced at her watch. The flight was already running 5 minutes behind schedule. "Do you mind hurrying up?" she snapped, her voice carrying through the cabin. "Some of us have important places to be." The man paused, his hands gripping the bag. He turned his head just enough for her to catch a glimpse of his face, young but lined with exhaustion, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite place. Without a word, he nodded and finished stowing his bag, moving with quiet efficiency. Celia dismissed the incident as quickly as it had happened. She returned to her laptop, her fingers flying over the keys. Yet despite her focus, a strange unease settled in her chest. She told herself it was the delay. She hated falling behind schedule. As the plane took off, Celia found herself stealing glances at the man. He was seated across the aisle, his posture stiff and his hands resting on his lap. He stared straight ahead, as if lost in thought. For reasons she couldn't explain, Celia felt compelled to study him. His uniform was immaculate, adorned with insignia she didn't recognize. His face, now relaxed, bore a quiet intensity. The flight attendant approached their row, a warm smile lighting her face as she offered drinks. "Coffee, please," the man said, his voice steady but low. Celia noticed the flight attendant's expression shift. There was something more than politeness in her demeanor, respect, perhaps even admiration. "Are you heading home, Commander?" the attendant asked softly. The man nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Been a long time." "Welcome back," the attendant said, her voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you for your service." Celia watched the exchange with a growing sense of discomfort. She couldn't shake the flight attendant's tone, or the way the man had responded. Who was he? What had he endured? Why did this small moment feel so significant? For the rest of the flight, Celia's mind wandered. Her usual laser-sharp focus failed her. Instead, she found herself replaying her harsh words to the man earlier. She had dismissed him without a second thought, treating him as an inconvenience rather than a person. The realization stung. As the plane began its descent, Celia closed her laptop, the report on the screen unfinished. She looked out the window, the sprawling city below coming into view. For the first time in a long while, she felt a pang of something unfamiliar, regret. She glanced across the aisle at the man again. His hands gripped the strap of his duffel bag, his expression unreadable. Celia knew she didn't owe him anything. Her impatience wasn't uncommon. She had spoken similarly to countless people over the years. Yet, this time felt different. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their arrival. Passengers began gathering their belongings, the usual shuffle and murmur filling the cabin. Celia remained seated, her heart racing as she made a decision. She couldn't disembark without saying something. She didn't know if it would matter to him, but it mattered to her. As the man stood to retrieve his bag, Celia rose as well. "Excuse me," she said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. He turned to face her, his tired eyes meeting hers. "I wanted to apologize," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "For earlier. I was impatient, and I shouldn't have spoken to you that way. I'm sorry." The man studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said simply. "I appreciate that." Celia nodded, unsure of what else to say. She stepped aside, letting him pass, but the brief exchange stayed with her. As she walked through the terminal, her mind churned. She couldn't explain it, but the encounter had shaken something loose in her, a realization that perhaps her relentless pursuit of efficiency had come at a cost. For the first time in years, Celia felt compelled to pause, to reflect, to wonder if there was more to life than the perfectly curated world she had built, and she couldn't ignore the quiet yet persistent feeling that the answer was yes. The unsettling encounter. Celia sat at the airport cafe, a steaming cup of black coffee untouched in front of her. She had planned to spend the layover reviewing her presentation for the upcoming meeting, but her laptop remained closed in her bag. Instead, she found herself staring out the window, watching the planes taxi to and from the gates. Her mind kept circling back to the interaction on the plane. The man's quiet demeanor, his weary yet composed posture, and most of all, the way he had accepted her apology without a hint of resentment. It wasn't the first time she had been brusque with someone. Far from it, but this time felt different. His uniform, his silence, and the respect he commanded from the flight attendant had unsettled something in her. Why couldn't she let it go? She sighed and opened her phone, scrolling aimlessly through emails. The usual flood of urgent requests and status updates filled the screen. Yet, for the first time, she found it difficult to care. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she replayed the flight attendant's words in her mind. "Welcome back." The sincerity in her voice had been unmistakable, a warmth that seemed almost reverent. "Who is he?" Celia muttered under her breath. The terminal bustled with activity, passengers rushing to their gates or lingering at overpriced kiosks. Celia's gate was crowded, and the announcement of a delayed boarding time only heightened the collective frustration. She sighed, resigned to the disruption, and took a seat near the window. She noticed the same Navy officer from her flight sitting a few rows away, his duffel bag at his feet. His eyes were closed, his head resting against the back of the chair, but his posture remained upright, alert, even in apparent rest. Celia studied him from a distance, her curiosity mingled with guilt. She had apologized, but the weight of her earlier words lingered. It wasn't just about what she had said, it was the ease with which she had dismissed him. For someone who prided herself on being sharp and perceptive, she had completely overlooked him as a person. "Excuse me," she heard a soft voice nearby. She turned to see a woman, likely in her late 60s, standing in front of the officer. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and she clutched a small tote bag. The officer opened his eyes and immediately stood, offering her a polite smile. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "My grandson is in the Navy, and it means a lot to see someone like you out here, representing us." The officer nodded, his expression warm but subdued. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot." The woman beamed, then moved on, leaving the officer to settle back into his seat. Celia watched the exchange with a strange sense of envy. She had built her career on commanding rooms and earning respect, yet here was a man who seemed to inspire gratitude simply by existing. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, more than the uniform, more than the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. By the time boarding was called, Celia felt as though she had spent the entire layover on edge. She wasn't used to feeling this way, unsure, introspective, vulnerable. The flight to New York would be short, and she told herself she would focus on work this time. There was no point dwelling on the stranger any longer. As she took her seat on the plane, she noticed with a jolt that the officer was seated in her row, just across the aisle. He gave her a polite nod as he adjusted his bag under the seat. She nodded back, unsure whether to say something or let the silence remain. The plane began to taxi, and Celia opened her laptop, determined to dive into the presentation she had rehearsed a dozen times. But once again, she found her focus wavering. She glanced at the officer, who was looking out the window, his face unreadable. What was he thinking? Where was he going? Was someone waiting for him? The flight attendant came by with the drink cart, and Celia hesitated before ordering sparkling water. When the attendant reached the officer, her tone softened again. "Coffee, please," he said, his voice as calm and steady as before. "Of course," the attendant replied, her smile lingering a moment longer than usual. Celia's curiosity finally got the better of her. As the flight attendant moved on, she turned to the officer. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quiet. He looked at her, his expression neutral but attentive. "Yes. I couldn't help but notice earlier," she began awkwardly. "The flight attendant seemed to know you, or at least she spoke to you like she did." The officer gave a small smile, almost imperceptible. "Not personally, but people like her recognize the uniform. Sometimes that's enough." Celia nodded, unsure what to say next. She felt an inexplicable need to keep the conversation going, but the words eluded her. "You're coming back from deployment?" she asked finally. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. 8 months at sea." 8 months. Celia tried to imagine what that would be like, but the thought slipped away before she could grasp it. She cleared her throat. "That must be challenging." The officer's smile faded slightly, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "It has its moments, but we do what we have to." There was a finality to his words, as if he had said all he intended to say on the subject. Celia nodded again, feeling both grateful for his response and frustrated by her inability to dig deeper. She returned to her laptop, but the screen seemed to blur before her eyes. As the plane began its descent, Celia's mind was a storm of thoughts. The officer had closed his eyes again, his face calm but far from peaceful. She wondered if he was thinking about home, about the people waiting for him, or perhaps about those who weren't. She glanced down at her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. This wasn't like her. She didn't dwell on strangers or worry about things she couldn't control. Her world was orderly, predictable, and she liked it that way. So why did this man's presence feel like a crack in the carefully constructed walls of her life? The plane landed with a jolt, and passengers began gathering their belongings. The officer stood, reaching for his bag with practiced ease. Celia hesitated, her hand gripping the armrest. She wanted to say something, but the words felt heavy and uncertain. As he turned to leave, she found her voice. "Commander," she said, her tone firmer than she expected. He paused, looking at her with mild curiosity. "Yes. Thank you," she said simply, "for everything you do." For a moment, his expression remained unreadable. Then he nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "You're welcome." And with that he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of travelers. Celia sat frozen in her seat, the hum of the emptying plane surrounding her. She felt an ache in her chest that she couldn't quite define. It wasn't regret, exactly. It was something deeper, something that had been missing in her life for a long time. As she gathered her things and stepped into the bustling terminal, Celia realized she had been shaken in a way she didn't fully understand. The officer had been a stranger, a passing figure in her meticulously ordered life. Yet, somehow, he had left a mark. She knew she couldn't let this moment pass without reflection. Whatever it meant, she had to figure it out. Because for the first time in years, Celia Hartman felt the faint stirrings of something she had almost forgotten. The need to connect. The unfinished apology. Celia Hartman had returned to her bustling life in Manhattan, but she couldn't shake the encounter with the Navy officer. Days had passed, yet his quiet presence lingered like a melody she couldn't get out of her head. Work continued as usual, long meetings, endless emails, and high-stakes negotiations, but her focus wavered in ways it never had before. In her corner office on the 27th floor, sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the room. Celia sat at her desk, staring blankly at the glowing screen of her laptop. Her assistant, Fiona, had just left after running through her schedule for the day. Normally, Celia would have been energized by the prospect of back-to-back meetings, but today, the thought filled her with an inexplicable fatigue. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but instead of typing, she found herself replaying the moment on the plane when she had apologized to the officer, Commander Nathan Cole. She had learned from his nameplate. He had accepted her apology with a quiet grace that now felt more haunting than relieving. She hadn't just been apologizing for that one moment of impatience. She realized she was apologizing for something larger, something that had been building within her for years. That evening, Celia found herself walking through Central Park, a habit she had abandoned long ago in favor of late hours at the office. The cool autumn air was a welcome reprieve from the stuffy boardrooms and endless conference calls. She clutched a cup of coffee in her gloved hands, the warmth radiating through the paper. Around her, the city buzzed with life. Joggers, dog walkers, couples strolling hand in hand. For once, she didn't feel the rush to keep moving. Her thoughts drifted to the Navy officer again. She wondered where he was now. Had he reached his destination? Was he holding his child for the first time? The idea stirred something inside her, an ache she couldn't quite place. It wasn't regret, exactly, but it was close. She found a bench near the edge of the pond and sat down, watching the reflections of skyscrapers ripple in the water. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, but she ignored it. Instead, she pulled out a small notebook she had started carrying recently. It wasn't for work, just a place to jot down thoughts that didn't fit neatly into her spreadsheets and presentations. She opened it to a blank page and wrote, "Why did his story stay with me? Why does it feel like I missed something? What am I really apologizing for?" The last question hung in the air as she stared at the words. She thought about the life she had built, the relentless pursuit of success that had left little room for anything or anyone else. Was that what she was apologizing for? Not just to Nathan Cole, but to herself. The next morning, Celia arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building was still quiet, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the empty hallways. She headed straight for the break room, where Fiona was unpacking her things. "Morning," Fiona said brightly. "You're here early." "I couldn't sleep," Celia admitted, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She hesitated, then added, "Fiona, have you ever felt like you owe someone more than just an apology? Like there's something deeper you should have said but didn't?" Fiona looked surprised. "I guess so." "Why?" Celia shook her head, just thinking out loud. Fiona smiled knowingly. "Well, if you feel like there's more to say, you should say it. Sometimes people don't need grand gestures, just honesty." Celia nodded, her assistant's words resonating more than she expected. She returned to her office, sat down at her desk, and opened her laptop. Instead of diving into her usual morning emails, she searched for the name, Commander Nathan Cole. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, maybe news about his deployment, maybe a way to contact him. What she found instead was an article in a military publication. The headline read, "Commander Nathan Cole returns home after lengthy deployment. A father's first meeting with his son." Celia's breath caught as she clicked on the article. A photograph accompanied the text. Nathan standing on a tarmac, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, a broad smile breaking his otherwise composed face. In his arms, he cradled a tiny infant bundled in a blue blanket. A woman, presumably his wife, stood beside him, her expression one of relief and joy. The article detailed Nathan's 8-month deployment aboard a Navy destroyer. It mentioned his exemplary service, his leadership under challenging circumstances, and his return to a family he had barely seen since the birth of his son. Celia read every word, her chest tightening as she absorbed the details. She thought about her own life, her relentless schedules, and carefully curated routines, and how little time she had allowed for anything beyond work. The picture lingered on her screen. Nathan's joy was palpable, but so was the weight he had carried. Celia felt a pang of shame. She had snapped at him without a second thought, reducing him to an inconvenience. She had apologized. But had it been enough? Celia closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Fiona's words echoed in her head. If you feel like there's more to say, you should say it. She reached for her notebook and wrote a new question. What does an apology really mean? It wasn't about the words, she realized. It was about understanding the other person, about recognizing their story and acknowledging their humanity. For the first time in years, Celia allowed herself to pause. She thought about the countless people she had brushed past in her pursuit of success. She thought about Nathan, sitting silently across the aisle, carrying a weight she could never fully understand. And she thought about herself, how she had built walls around her life, walls that kept her focused but also isolated. That afternoon, Celia made a decision. She called Fiona into her office and asked her to clear the rest of her schedule for the day. Something personal, she explained when Fiona raised an eyebrow. It wasn't like Celia to take time off, but she didn't care. She left the office and headed to the military base mentioned in the article. She didn't know if Nathan would be there or if she would even be allowed in, but she felt compelled to try. She needed closure, not just for him, but for herself. When she arrived, the base was bustling with activity. Uniformed personnel moved with purpose, their lives steeped in discipline and duty. Celia felt out of place in her tailored suit and heels, but she pushed the discomfort aside. She approached the front desk and asked for Nathan Cole. The young woman behind the desk looked at her skeptically. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Celia admitted, "but I flew with him recently, and I'd like to speak with him. It's important." The woman studied her for a moment, then picked up the phone. After a brief conversation, she hung up and nodded. "Commander Cole is available. I'll let him know you're here." Celia waited in a small, nondescript room. Her heart raced as she rehearsed what she wanted to say. When Nathan finally walked in, dressed in a crisp uniform, she stood and extended her hand. "Commander Cole," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Thank you for seeing me." Nathan shook her hand, his expression curious but guarded. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I know," Celia said. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I wanted to thank you again. For your service, for your patience, and for accepting my apology on the plane. But I also wanted to say, I don't think I really understood what I was apologizing for until now." Nathan's brows furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. "I've spent so much of my life focused on work, on being efficient and successful, that I've forgotten to see people as people. I dismissed you without thinking, and that wasn't fair. You were coming home to your family, and I didn't even stop to consider what that might mean. I'm sorry, not just for that moment, but for the way I've let myself become disconnected from others." Nathan was silent for a moment, his gaze steady. Then he nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. "It takes a lot to admit something like that." Celia felt a weight lift off her chest. "It's something I need to work on," she said. "And I wanted you to know that meeting you, it made me realize that." Nathan's lips quirked into a faint smile. "We all have things we're working on," he said. "And for what it's worth, I appreciate you taking the time to come here. Not everyone would." Celia nodded, her heart full yet strangely light. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had done something meaningful. Not for a deal, not for a promotion, but for herself. As she left the base, the city lights began to glow against the fading daylight. Celia didn't know what changes lay ahead, but she knew one thing. She was ready to start seeing the world differently, not as a series of transactions or obstacles, but as a tapestry of lives intertwined with stories worth noticing. The ripple effect. The visit to the military base lingered in Celia's mind like a pebble dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through every aspect of her life. As the days turned into weeks, she found herself questioning the routines and priorities that had once seemed unshakable. She had returned to her office, but it didn't feel the same. The drive that had once fueled her felt hollow, as if the engine powering her ambition had sputtered to a stop. She began to notice things she hadn't before: the fatigue in her team's faces after long hours, the strained smiles of colleagues who hid their struggles behind professionalism, the fleeting moments of vulnerability that were quickly masked by corporate facades. For so long, she had viewed her career as a ladder, each rung a step closer to success. But now she wondered if she had been climbing in the wrong direction. Celia sat in her office late one evening, the city lights twinkling like distant stars beyond the glass. A proposal for a major merger sat open on her desk, but she couldn't bring herself to focus. Instead, she found herself replaying the conversation with Nathan Cole at the base. His quiet acknowledgement of her apology had been gracious, but it was his final words that stayed with her. "We all have things we're working on." What was she working on? For years, the answer had been obvious: her career, her reputation, her next big win. But now, the question felt deeper, more personal. What was she doing to make herself better, not as a professional, but as a person? Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Fiona, her assistant. "Team meeting tomorrow at 10. Let me know if you want me to prep anything specific." Celia stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a response. "Let's skip the usual agenda. I want to try something different." The next morning, her team gathered in the conference room, their faces a mix of curiosity and confusion. Fiona had passed along Celia's instructions, but no one seemed to know what to expect. Celia stood at the head of the table, feeling an uncharacteristic flutter of nerves. She was used to commanding rooms, but this felt different, more vulnerable. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady but softer than usual. "I know this isn't our typical meeting, but I've been thinking a lot about how we work together, and I realized something. We're so focused on results, on deadlines, deliverables, and metrics, that we rarely take the time to think about each other." Her team exchanged puzzled glances, but no one interrupted. "I want to change that," Celia continued. "So today, instead of diving into projects, I want us to have a conversation. I want to know how you're doing, not just professionally, but personally. What's working for you? What's not? What can I do to support you better?" The room fell silent. For a moment, Celia worried she had miscalculated, that her team would see this as an awkward detour from more pressing matters. But then Ethan, a junior analyst who rarely spoke up, cleared his throat. "Well," he began hesitantly, "I guess I'll start. I've been struggling a bit, to be honest. My wife just went back to work, and juggling daycare for our daughter has been harder than I expected." Celia nodded, her expression attentive. "Thank you for sharing that, Ethan. How can we help? Is there anything we can adjust to make things easier for you?" Ethan hesitated, then smiled. "Actually, yeah. If I could shift my hours a bit to avoid the daycare rush, that would make a huge difference." "Done," Celia said without hesitation. The floodgates opened after that. One by one, her team members began sharing their challenges. Parents struggling with elder care, employees feeling burned out, even Fiona admitting she had been taking on too much because she didn't want to let anyone down. The room transformed from a sterile conference space into a place of genuine connection. By the end of the meeting, Celia felt something she hadn't in a long time. Pride, not in her achievements, but in her team. That evening, as she walked home through the city, Celia felt lighter. The meeting had been a small step, but it felt significant. She thought again about Nathan Cole, about the weight he had carried without complaint, and how her brief encounter with him had become a turning point. She stopped at a bookstore on a whim, drawn to the warm glow of the lights inside. Wandering through the aisles, she picked up a book about leadership, not the kind that focused on strategy or efficiency, but one that emphasized empathy and connection. She bought it and tucked it into her bag, feeling a small flicker of hope that she was on the right path. The next week, Celia attended a networking event hosted by one of her firm's major clients. It was the kind of gathering she used to thrive in, navigating the room with practiced ease. But now, she found herself lingering on the edges, observing rather than engaging. She noticed a man standing near the bar, his uniform unmistakable, another Navy officer. Celia felt her heart quicken as she approached him, unsure what she intended to say. "Excuse me," she began. "Are you in the same unit as Commander Nathan Cole?" The man turned, surprised. "I am," he said. "Do you know Nathan?" "Not well," Celia admitted. "I flew with him recently. He made an impression." The officer smiled. "He does that. Nathan's one of the best. Quiet, steady, but always the first to step up when it counts." Celia nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude. "Do you think you could pass along a message for me?" "Of course," the officer said. Celia hesitated, then smiled. "Just tell him thank you, again, and let him know that what he said made a difference." The officer nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think he'll appreciate that." As Celia left the event, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The ripple effect of her encounter with Nathan Cole was still unfolding, but she knew one thing for certain. It had set her on a new course. One that wasn't about perfection or control, but about seeing the world, and the people in it, with fresh eyes. The city stretched out before her, alive with possibilities. And for the first time in years, Celia Hartman was ready to embrace them. Breaking down walls. Celia awoke to the soft hum of the city outside her apartment, the faint morning light filtering through her curtains. The buzz of New York was familiar and constant, but for the first time in years, it felt different, quieter somehow, as if the noise couldn't quite reach her. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the notebook on her nightstand. Its pages, filled with scribbled thoughts and half-formed questions, had become her companion over the past few weeks. She opened it and read the line she had written the night before. What would it look like to live a life that's not just about success, but about meaning? The question lingered as she went about her morning routine. By the time she arrived at the office, the thought had settled into her like a seed waiting to grow. Her team greeted her with the usual mix of politeness and mild apprehension, but she noticed that something had shifted. The meeting from the previous week, the one where they had opened up about their struggles, seemed to have left its mark. People were smiling more, talking more. The atmosphere felt lighter, as though an invisible weight had been lifted. Celia spent the morning preparing for a presentation with one of the firm's biggest clients. It was a critical meeting, one that could solidify her position as a partner in the firm. Normally, she would have been laser-focused, rehearsing her points and anticipating every possible question. But today, her mind kept drifting. She thought about Ethan and his request to adjust his hours, about the junior analyst who had shared her fears of burnout, and about Fiona, whose workload Celia had promised to help redistribute. More than anything, she thought about Nathan Cole. She wondered if he had settled back into life with his family, if he had held his son in his arms and felt the same sense of completeness she now craved. The memory of his calm presence on the plane and the weight of his words at the base tugged at her. We all have things we're working on. The meeting went well, better than expected, even. The clients were impressed. The deal was all but secured, and Celia's colleagues congratulated her with genuine enthusiasm. But as she sat in the sleek conference room, the glow of her success felt dim. The praise, the accolades, the satisfaction of a job well done, it all felt hollow compared to the deeper fulfillment she had started to glimpse. Later that evening, as the city lights began to twinkle, Celia found herself wandering aimlessly through Central Park. She had no destination in mind, no meeting to rush to or deadline to meet. Her thoughts swirled with a mix of restlessness and clarity. She was beginning to see the outlines of what she wanted her life to be, but she didn't yet know how to fill in the details. She stopped at a small cafe near the park's edge and ordered a coffee, taking a seat by the window. As she sipped her drink, she pulled out her notebook and wrote, "What do I want my legacy to be? What kind of leader do I want to be? What kind of person do I want to be?" The questions felt enormous, almost too much to tackle. But for the first time, Celia wasn't afraid of them. She was ready to try. The next morning, Celia arrived at the office with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She called Fiona into her office and handed her a folder. "This is the groundwork for a new initiative I want to propose," she said. Fiona raised an eyebrow. "What kind of initiative?" Celia smiled. "Something that focuses on people. I want to start offering flexible schedules, mental health resources, and mentorship programs. We talk a lot about being a company that values its employees, but I want us to actually live up to that." Fiona looked surprised but intrigued. "That's ambitious." "I know," Celia said, "but it's important." Over the next few weeks, Celia threw herself into the project. She met with HR, consulted with team leaders, and even held one-on-one meetings with employees to gather input. The process was slow and sometimes frustrating, but it was also deeply rewarding. For the first time, Celia felt like she was building something that mattered, not just to her career, but to the people around her. One afternoon, as she was reviewing the final proposal, her phone buzzed. It was an email from the officer she had met at the networking event, the one who knew Nathan Cole. The subject line read, "Message delivered." Celia's heart raced as she opened it. The email was brief but warm. "Celia, I passed along your message to Nathan. He said to tell you thank you, and that your words made a difference. Best, Lieutenant Commander Jeff Daniels." Celia sat back in her chair, her chest tightening. She thought about Nathan's journey, about the strength and humility he had shown in their brief interactions. She thought about how his story had pushed her to reevaluate her own life. And she thought about the ripple effect, how one moment, one person, could spark a chain reaction that changed everything. That evening, Celia stood on the rooftop of her apartment building, watching the city stretch out before her. The air was crisp, and the lights of Manhattan glowed like a constellation. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace, not because she had everything figured out, but because she was finally asking the right questions. As she gazed out at the horizon, she thought about the life she wanted to build, the connection she wanted to nurture, and the impact she wanted to leave behind. She thought about Nathan Cole and how his quiet strength had inspired her to break down the walls she had spent years constructing. Celia closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing. She was ready to start living a life that wasn't just about success, but about meaning. And for the first time, that felt like enough. A new chapter begins. The early morning sunlight streamed into Celia's apartment, casting warm golden hues on the minimalist decor she had once prided herself on. Her space had always reflected her life. Clean, efficient, and devoid of unnecessary clutter. But today, as she sipped her coffee at the kitchen counter, she noticed how sterile it felt. She glanced at her notebook, now brimming with questions, reflections, and ideas. It had become her companion, a map guiding her toward a destination she was only beginning to understand. The message from Nathan Cole, delivered through Lieutenant Commander Daniels, had lingered with her for days. "Your words made a difference." It was a simple acknowledgement, yet it carried profound weight. Nathan's quiet validation felt like a bridge between her old self, the driven, unyielding executive, and the person she was striving to become. Celia closed the notebook and stood, determination settling in her chest. Today was the day she would present her proposal for the employee initiative. It wasn't just about policy changes. It was about creating a culture where people felt valued, seen, and supported. A stark contrast to the environment she had once thrived in, but now found stifling. When she arrived at the office, Fiona greeted her with a wide smile. "Good luck today," she said, handing Celia a neatly bound copy of the proposal. "Thank you," Celia replied, her voice steady, but laced with anticipation. The meeting with the senior partners was scheduled for mid-morning, and she felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that usually accompanied high-stakes moments. This time, however, it wasn't about closing a deal or impressing clients. It was about something much more personal. The boardroom was as imposing as ever, with its long polished table and panoramic view of Manhattan. The senior partners filed in one by one, their expressions neutral but expectant. Margaret Tanner, Celia's longtime mentor and the firm's most formidable figure, sat at the head of the table. She gave Celia a curt nod, signaling her to begin. Celia stood, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. She had rehearsed her opening statement, but as she looked around the room, she decided to speak from the heart instead. "For years, this firm has been my world," she began. "I've given everything to it. My time, my energy, my focus. And in return, it has given me incredible opportunities. But in the process, I've come to realize something important. Success doesn't mean much if it comes at the expense of connection, of humanity." She paused, letting her words sink in. The partners exchanged glances, some intrigued, others skeptical. "I'm here today to propose an initiative that will help us build a culture that values people as much as it values results. Flexible schedules, mental health resources, mentorship programs. These aren't just perks. They're investments in our greatest asset, our employees." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Celia, this sounds noble, but how does it align with the firm's bottom line?" "We're in the business of profit, not philanthropy." Celia nodded, prepared for the question. "Retention and productivity," she said firmly. "Studies show that employees who feel supported are not only more loyal, but also more innovative. Happy employees lead to happy clients, and in an industry as competitive as ours, fostering a reputation as a firm that truly values its people could set us apart." She continued, outlining the specific components of the initiative and backing each one with data. As she spoke, she felt the room shift. Some of the partners leaned forward, their interest piqued. Others remained stoic, but Celia could see the wheels turning. When she finished, the room fell silent. Margaret tapped her pen against the table, her gaze fixed on Celia. "You make a compelling case," she said finally. "But this is a significant shift in how we operate. Are you prepared to lead it?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Celia met Margaret's eyes and said, "Yes, I am." The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and emails, but Celia felt a strange calmness settle over her. The partners had agreed to pilot the initiative, giving her the green light to move forward. It was a small victory, but to Celia, it felt monumental. That evening, as she walked home, she thought about Nathan Cole. She wished she could tell him what his words had inspired, how his quiet strength had pushed her to reevaluate everything. She knew she might never see him again, but the impact he had left on her life was indelible. A month later, the first phase of the initiative was rolled out. Celia held a town hall meeting to introduce the changes, standing in front of the entire office with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. As she spoke, she could see the skepticism in some faces, but also the spark of hope in others. For the first time, she felt like she was building something that truly mattered. After the meeting, Ethan approached her. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. It's going to make a difference." Celia smiled, her chest swelling with gratitude. "That's the goal." As the weeks turned into months, Celia began to see the ripple effects of the initiative. Morale improved, productivity rose, and employees began to open up in ways she hadn't expected. Celia herself felt lighter, freer. She had started volunteering on weekends, reconnecting with friends she had long neglected, and even taking time to explore the city she loved, but rarely appreciated. One evening, as she flipped through her notebook, she found an old question she had written. What would it look like to live a life that's not just about success, but about meaning? For the first time, she felt like she had an answer. On a crisp autumn day, Celia received a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, but when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a simple note. Celia, thank you for your words and for seeing me that day on the plane. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what impact I had on you, but I want you to know that your message made an impact on me too. Sometimes we don't realize the difference we make in others' lives. It seems we've both found that to be true. Wishing you all the best. Nathan Cole. Celia held the letter in her hands, a smile spreading across her face. It wasn't closure, it was something better. It was a reminder that the connections we make, however fleeting, can change the course of our lives. As she looked out at the bustling city below, Celia felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had spent so much of her life chasing success, but now she understood that true fulfillment came from something much deeper. The courage to change, the willingness to connect, and the strength to find meaning in the unexpected. And for the first time, she was ready to embrace it all.